Hey guys, welcome back to Release the Craftin. Priscilla here with another little edition of Release the Craftin reviews. That's not what the official name of this segment is. It's actually a book club review, because if you guys don't know, if you're just joining me for the first time, I have like a little impromptu book club, where basically I have been reading Greek myth retellings all year, and I have like an open door book club that you can join in, you can join out. It's up to you. I have that. I've been doing it all year long. It's been a lot of fun. I've really been enjoying it, and here I am sharing it with you guys. So, let's jump into it. I am reviewing Daughters of Olympus by Hannah Lynn. That was our book club book for August, and I'm a little bit behind, but I've just been busy. I actually really enjoyed this book, and I've been like excited to share it with you guys and tell you my thoughts on it. But I just haven't had the time. So we're getting to it now. Never too late to get to it. So, before I start my review, I'll do like a spoiler-free part, and then I'll do a spoiler part, and I'll give you guys a heads up when I get there, just in case you're still wanting to read this book. But also, if you are like, oh man, I wanted to join the book club, but I already missed the last month's book. Well, no worries. You can join us for next month's book, which is September's book, which is going to be The Heir of Venus by Shepperson. That's the book that I picked. So we're going to read that this month, and then you can join in the conversation. If you've already read, though, Daughters of Olympus, and you want to join the conversation, just shoot me a line. Sorry, my camera was traveling. Shoot me a line over on Instagram, and I will add you to our little group chat. You can join the discussion there. It's been pretty fun. We have some really good conversations there about the books, but here we go. Daughters of Olympus. I'm going to share my thoughts on this. Essentially, I liked this book. I liked it a fair bit. I don't want to say like a lot, because that might be more than I liked it, but I liked it a fair bit. I found it to be a very decent, very straightforward read. If I had to give it a rating, I would give it 7.5 pomegranates out of anything. It's arbitrary. The numbers don't mean anything. But at any rate, I found the book to be very enjoyable. More so in the first half than the second half, which was really surprising to me, because essentially this novel is the story of Demeter and Persephone / Core, depending on what part of the book you're in, and it's sort of telling their version of stories from each of their individual perspectives, and it seems like a recipe for success. These are some of my favorite deities. I work with them in my own personal practice, and then like reading a story about them should be like a 10 out of 10, but there were some things that made it not so a 10 out of 10 for me. And I was kind of surprised. Essentially, I like the story. It's very good, very straightforward. The first part of the book is from Demeter's perspective, and just going to give you guys right off the top, this book has trigger warnings, like, yeah, it's got trigger warnings. There's lots of depictions of Demeter's, like, sexual assaults. There's violence towards women. It's in here. It's not, like, super graphic or anything like that, but it's in the book, so be aware if those are things that would cause you distress. Do not pick up this book. That being said, the first half of the book does follow Demeter, her stories, all of the ups and downs that come with that, and it makes her a very sympathetic character, which I really appreciate, because I think most stories tend to depict Demeter as sort of the overbearing mother type, and maybe to the point of actually being an abuser herself, because she's so overbearing and controlling over Core, like Persephone. This one, it's sort of, I guess the overbearing nature of it is sort of scaled back. She is very overprotective, for sure, and I think the book does a good job of making you understand why she acts this way, what the behavior stems from, and it really sets up her story very well. It makes her a very sympathetic character who you can also be like, hey, like, you do kind of have to, you know, give your kids some freedoms and not be so afraid of loss. And I think that the story works really well to narrate that, to demonstrate that, and to both portray her as a flawed character who is trying to do what she thinks is best. So I found Demeter's like section to be very fascinating. It's a very interesting take on the character, not one I was anticipating, and I think they do it very well. And then the part where this book starts to get a little bit shaky for me, surprisingly, is when we get into the core chapters. So it picks up in part 2 with Cora's perspective on events. It backtracks a little bit to give you like some side story and stuff from her perspectives, and it's fine. But a lot of it is sort of retreading what you just witnessed through the Demeter perspective, and I'm not against getting different perspectives of the same event. I just didn't find a lot of value in that rehashing. Also, it was very long rehashing those particular events, so it was it probably just was overly done, which is fine. It didn't deter me from reading the rest of the story. It did just make me go, oh, okay, so we're dwelling here for quite a while. All right. And then it does do a good job of painting Cora as a separate entity from her mother, who has her own wants and desires and stuff like that. And then when it moves into part 3, you get into Persephone and her sort of reclaiming her power and her own personal identity while she tries to traverse the underworld. And all of that was very good. A little bit redundant. There were lots of like sentences and phrases that got repeated over and over again because it was essentially a waiting game, which is okay, but it was not my favorite thing. I was ready to stop hearing them say the same sentences over and over. And by the time I got to the end of the book, I was like, okay, all right. And I think part of this for me, personally, I would have just liked to see this be 2 separate books. If it had just been book 1 from Demeter's perspective, and then book 2 was from Persephone's perspective, and they were released at different times, the rehashing wouldn't have felt like rehashing so much as was sort of a recap of the story, so that you could, you know, get back to being familiar with the events of the previous book and sort of the different perspective from there. I think if this had been 2 completely separate entities, it would have read a lot better to me, but it was all in one, so I was reading it all at once, and I didn't need to be recapped or really spend as much time going through stuff that happened already previously. So that's like my only detractor of this book, on top of another issue, which is essentially that for me, none of the male characters in the book are given any sort of depth or characterization beyond like their one-note character hints and traits. And even when we get to what's supposed to be the main love interest of the story, or essentially Hades and Persephone's like relationship dynamic, Hades is never fleshed out as a character, so like none of the male characters get fleshed out. And I kind of understood after reading a couple other reviews that that might have been done to just make this solely a story about the women and focusing on the women characters, because their characters get very fleshed out. Even the side characters who don't spend a lot of time there, they get a lot of characterization, which is fine. But like, it seems to me to be in that sort of weird space of like reverse feminism, when you feminism too much, that you start to like sort of bite back at your own cause, because it is sort of a fight for equality, not supremacy. And while I'm not saying that the male voices should have eclipsed the female voices, as this is a story about women, at least one of the male characters could have been a bit more fleshed out. There were a lot of quirks in Hades' personality that I didn't understand the source of, or the reasoning behind, outside of like, this is just a weird thing he does. And I would have liked to have a bit more perspective on that to understand his character and why eventually they form a relationship outside of proximity. That's basically part of my biggest attraction. There were other male characters in the story that I didn't think needed as much screen time or, you know, page time. So I was okay with their characters not being fully fleshed out. Certain characters were written to be one note, so they served their purpose. But just in this particular instance, I was like, we could have fleshed out one male character to, you know, help us sort of understand where they're coming from, especially when you're trying to paint this particular male character as not as bad as the other men that they've all encountered. He could have used a little bit more body, I guess. But that's going to be it for the spoiler-free review. If you guys want to hear the spoilers, stay tuned. This is your ample warning to cut away, go read the book, and come back if you want to hear the other perspectives. So, spoilers. Essentially, I like I said, I like this book. I like this book a lot, and very surprisingly, I found myself more in Camp Demeter than anywhere else, which was not where I expected to be, especially because I'm such a Persephone stan that I was like, I'm going to be down bad for her. But I don't know if it's just the way that they were written, or the fact that we got to spend the most time developing the story for Demeter, that even when it came time for parts 2 and 3, which were arguably just as long, if not longer, than Demeter's section of the story, But when it came time to get there, all of the story for core Persephone started as was launched off of things that happened in Demeter's story. So it was still essentially Demeter's story up until you get to part 3 and it's Persephone in the underworld, and then it's sort of no longer Demeter's story. But by then, the first 2 parts of the book have been all about Demeter and the events that happened around her that centralized her perspective on things, and then a little bit of Core's perspective on those same events. And I was really surprised to see that. Also, I was like not anticipating that the sexual assault would be on page, but it was on page, and that was surprising, but not surprising in the way that like Sisters of Medusa was. I can't even remember that's the actual name of the book, but it's a book I read earlier this year. It was less surprising because I could see it coming. It was very well telegraphed. But then I was like, oh, okay, we're doing it. We're committing to the bit on all of these like assaults. And essentially the crux of Demeter's story is having to be forced to be in these positions by men. They desire her, they want her, and they ignore her autonomy, they ignore her power, and they take what they want from her and they leave her to pick up the pieces and deal with the scraps. Because essentially what happens is she's first assaulted by her brother Zeus, who she has no romantic feelings for and trust, as he's her brother and he saved her from their father Cronus. Like she's underneath the impression that everything is safe and hunky-dory, but because Zeus wants her in the bodily way, she's not anticipating his assault. So he assaults her, and then she discovers that her ability isn't just to make things grow, but it's also to take life away, and she sort of finds out in the process of this that she has the ability to cause winter. And it's a power she doesn't really develop. It's just something she learns from this occasion, and she's also left having to give birth to his 2 children. So she ends up giving birth to a son, Iacchus, who is mortal, and then Persephone, who is immortal and has powers, and she has to raise them both because she's stuck with these kids. And she tries to do her best by them, except that Iacchus has no powers and he has a mortal life. So he's struggling. So her son is struggling, not with his mortality, but the fact that he isn't specially special like everybody else because he doesn't have any abilities. So she's trying to navigate that while her son becomes progressively more obnoxious and more brash and outspoken because he's the son of a god and they're in Olympus, and that's what boys do, especially when they're encouraged by a patriarchal society. Meanwhile, she has like the perfect child in Core, who is like her ride or die. So she's just like trying to be generous with her son while knowing that he's not going to live very long, and this is what it is because he feels left out, not of the immortality race, but of the powers race. And so that's like kind of what the beginning of the book focuses on, and then she's struggling to sort of, reclaim her own like autonomy after this attack, and she's left sort of without any support because her sister Hera, who unfortunately never gets a positive depiction no matter how hard like we advocate for that, the poor freaking woman instantly turns on her when Zeus assaults her. And she blames him for she blames Demeter, not him. She blames Demeter for taking a walk with her brother, which should be safe because they're brother and sister. But she blames her for taking a walk with him because she should have known that's what he wanted from her, and sort of turns the tables on her and cuts her off from this familial relationship from her sister, who, they went from being very close to now they are worlds apart because Demeter cannot understand where Hera is coming from, why she would victim blame her in that way, and Hera just cannot, pass the blame onto Zeus, so she has to pass it on to Demeter. And there's a mythological reason for that, which I kind of wish maybe had been, explored just a little bit more, or they had circled back to explain why Hera chooses to not ever blame Zeus. And it's because there was a point in time in the mythology where she did try to rebel against Zeus and essentially tried to overthrow him, and he punished her horrendously and basically quote unquote put her in her place, and from that point on she never retaliated against him again. She was absolutely terrified of the man and the backlash that would come from angering him, so chose instead to focus her rage on his victims as opposed to calling him out on his bullshit. And that's why Hera is the way she is. And not enough stories focus on that. And I kind of wish that, like, that had been brought up a little bit more, so that at least, like, the severing between sisters could have been, like, a little bit more sympathetic on both sides instead of just heavily on Demeter's side. But again, this is Demeter's story, so it doesn't have to, like, salvage the personality of Hera in the same process. But, like, I wish that it had. I wish one of these books could salvage Hera just a little bit. But then, you know, she moves on, Demeter moves on. She has a whirlwind romance in the course of a day with a mortal man that she has decided is the love of her life. They lay together, and then she ends up getting pregnant from that altercation? Nah, that's not the right word. From that situation, and Zeus, because he's Zeus, decides that he doesn't like that she took another lover, even though they weren't lovers, and kills the man for standing up for himself and for Demeter. And so then she's left again giving birth to twins without, like, any other support other than Kor to be there for her, and the nymphs that end up siding with her. And she leaves Olympus at this point because she cannot handle Zeus and his fuckery anymore, which, like, girl, I don't blame you. And she goes down to Earth. This is where she sets up her temple and her residence on Earth, where she's like, this is where I'm going to reside from now on. She pulls a big baller move and gets the fuck out of Olympus, and everyone's like, whoa. And the only person who supports her in leaving Olympus is actually Hephaestus. Because he's like, yeah, somebody finally stood up to that guy and somebody needed to, but I can't openly do it either. But I am going to support you by helping to build your home and, like, making sure that you guys are all set up. So Hephaestus does her a solid, which I was like, more of this guy, please. I really love a sympathetic Hephaestus. I might be partially biased because his depiction in Lore Olympus is, like, my favorite depiction of Hephaestus ever. But I love seeing a sympathetic Hephaestus doing the things that he's supposed to do. And, he doesn't come back into the story, unfortunately, and I really wish he had, like, at least a few more times to just be like, yeah, I am a cool, like, I'm a cool guy. I'm a cool nephew. Like, I could help you out. But he doesn't. So, once she gets set up, you know, sets up shop on Earth, everything's hunky-dory, except that she has to give birth to these two mortal twins, who she ends up just giving back to her mortal lover's family so that they have a bit of their legacy to carry on, because they lost both sons, technically. His other brother had died previously, and she doesn't feel like she has the capacity to raise these children without her lover present. And then she just spends, like, centuries mourning this man in a way that I thought was going to be obnoxious, but it actually wasn't. It was really a poignant take on grief and trying to process that, and just sort of how people withdraw into themselves and away from the world when, you know, they feel like a great loss and they experience great loss. And it's during this course of time that, you know, she starts to shelter Persephone, because every child she has dies. Her first mortal child died. Now she has these two mortal children who aren't dead yet, but they will die, and she doesn't even get to keep them because she had to give them back. Not that she had to. She chose to give them back to their mortal family. And, you know, the only child she has to keep with her is Kor, and so she starts to shelter her and keep her on this little island that they're staying on, and she doesn't let her go anywhere. And then eventually, as time goes on and she gets to process her guilt and stuff like that, and her grief gets worked through, she ends up, you know, taking the confidence of a nymph that ends up dying, because nymphs are not immortal, they're just very long-lived, who tells her, like, hey, you have to let your daughter do things. And so she does. She starts to acquiesce and let Persephone take, like, day trips into the mortal realms so that she can, like, explore the world, and everything is hunky-dory up until the day that Persephone comes back. She's absolutely devastated. They tell her it's because she witnessed a child being left to die in the wilderness, and Persephone ends up going through this whole grieving process, like, phase for centuries, and Demeter's trying to encourage her daughter through it, trying to support her, trying to be like, hey, what if we left the island? Like, would that make you feel better? But Persephone is also just as unresponsive as her mother was, or Kor is just as unresponsive as her mother was. And, you know, then you get to see that from Demeter's perspective, where she's a mother trying to struggle to, like, reinvigorate her child, help her child process the grief that she's very familiar with, but she can't really seem to get through until one day, Kor is fine, and she's like, all right, I'm back to normal, I'm getting the fuck off this island. And that's what she does, and everything seems to be, like, fine, except that Core goes missing. And then it takes off into the story of how Demeter goes to Eleusis to end up trying to find her daughter. And, she gets welcomed into a mortal house as a wet nurse. And I totally skipped over this part, but there was a part where Poseidon finally gets his mitts on her. So he also assaults her. And he assaults her as a horse, which is horrible to me. Horribler for her, of course. But, like, horses really unnerve me, so I hate this. And she ends up giving birth to a horse, which is, like, magical, super cool, super fast, super strong horse. And then she ends up also giving birth to what will eventually become a goddess of the Eleusinian mysteries, Desponia, who, from all I understand of her, is the goddess of winter, but she doesn't actually have anything written down about her, because she's a mystery cult, like, goddess. The Eleusinian mysteries were not written down. You had to be initiated to know what they were about. So she's in there. They mention, she shows up in some places. Her name is marked in places, and people don't know if it is another name for Core, or if it's another name for Demeter, or, like, the sort of triple goddess aspect that they might have represented, or if she's her own independent deity who just happens to be goddess of winter. Like, there's not a lot written down about her because she came from a mystery cult, but she does end up giving birth to Desponia, and then because she's so, like, distraught over the loss of Core and having to find her, but also distraught over being assaulted again by another one of her brothers, she decides she cannot, like, be responsible for raising Desponia, so she ends up abandoning Desponia to a mortal family, and they never circle back to that again. You never find out what happens. It's just sort of left open-ended for you to eventually figure it out, and if I didn't know that little bit of mythology, I would be in the dark for what happens to this girl after she abandons her to a mortal family. And I think that's probably a little bit of the things where I'm like, there's lots of these threads being left around, but not a lot being said about how we're picking them back up or tying them into, like, handy little knots, or they just were leaving them behind. And that's essentially what happened with that part of the story. And then when Demeter goes to Eleusis, she becomes a wet nurse. She tries to turn a mortal baby immortal, but then she is stopped by the other maid in the household, who thinks that she's trying to roast the baby alive, because the only way to do this is to cook this baby in a fire. It's a magical fire, so it's not actually burning the baby, but once the spell gets interrupted, the baby gets burned alive, and that was horrible. I should have probably put that in the trigger warnings. Sorry. Child death. It's too little, too late. I will put it as a note so people know. So, like, that's essentially, like, she ends up calling on, like, Hecate to help her find Persephone. She pisses off Hecate, but Hecate comes back, because Hecate is a girl's girl. She's a real one. She's like, I understand you're going through something. I'm not holding it against you since you called me to come back. That's kind of like an apology. So she does apologize, and she humbles herself to Hecate. So Hecate's like, yeah, let's go find your daughter. And together with Hecate, they start working out ways to do this. But at this point, Demeter is so upset that she can't get any leads on her daughter, that it may be implied, or it's very possible that Hades took her daughter to the underworld, that she starts taking her anger out on the mortal realm, essentially, by causing this eternal, endless winter. And she gets to the point where she refuses to, like, stop the winter until Persephone is returned to her. And then, that's where her part basically cuts off. And we start with Core's part, which goes back to rehash, having to deal with leaving Olympus and living on the mortal realm with her mother, who is overprotective of her, finally getting out to go do her day trips, and then what happens actually when she comes back from, like, all bereft and full of grief and ends up mourning the loss of a mortal for several centuries, is that she had fallen in love with somebody. And interestingly, they decided, or Hannah Lynn decided to make it so that Persephone took a mortal lover who was a lesbian. So they had a lesbian relationship. I don't know why I paused so weirdly there. I thought, like, this part of the story was fine. It was interesting. I don't think it was, like, super additive to the narrative, but it was still interesting to sort of see that Persephone had different interests before she ended up in this relationship with Hades. And what essentially happens is that she has a mortal lover who actually is married to another man, but it's a marriage of convenience, and the man himself is very, very old, so they don't have any relations together. And so she's sort of free to take another lover because her husband has no interest in being with her. And so she develops this relationship with Core, and they it's a very beautiful, very sweet relationship. And essentially what's going on is that the entire time they are together, Persephone keeps offering to make Ione, that's her name, immortal, and Ione keeps being like, nah, that's not for me, that's not the life for me, no thank you, hard pass. And she continues to do that all the way up into her old age. And even to the point where, like, you get the vibe that she kind of knows her life is coming to a close, and this would be her only way to continue living, but she still continues to reject Persephone. So it causes a little bit of tension between the two of them, because Persephone just wants to be together with her lover forever, and her lover keeps rejecting that love because she has no interest in immortality, which is interesting, and I'll come back to that later. But it gets to the point where one day Persephone goes to visit her, and Ione has actually passed. And that's the day where Persephone comes home late. She's upset, and then the nymphs end up telling Demeter a lie about the kid abandoned in the fields to cover up for the fact that she had a lover, and she did not tell her mother about it, because the nymphs that she was traveling with, she would separate from them, but they still, like, knew what's up, and they would still follow her to be like, oh yeah, she has a girlfriend, like, okay, no big deal, which is really cool. They're also girls, and I appreciate them for that. Unfortunately, though, Persephone spends like a couple centuries, grieving and mourning this loss, and then she finally decides to get back out into the world, at which point she is abducted by Hades. And because of this, when the nymphs come home to tell Demeter what happened, the ones who had been girls, like the real ones, Demeter turns them into sirens. Not just like birds, she turns them into the sirens, the ones like from the Odyssey who tried to lure men to their deaths by singing to them. She's like, how fucking dare you lose my child? She turns them into sirens. So for being girls, for being real ones, for, kind of lying to the goddess Demeter to protect the goddess Core, and her lies, they get punished, and you never hear from them again. And then Persephone gets dragged, or Core, she's still Core at this point, gets dragged to the underworld. Turns out it's a big misunderstanding, because Hades was underneath the impression that Core knew that she was going to go to the underworld, and that Zeus had already cleared everything with her and her mother, because Zeus essentially told Hades, like, you have to get married, and Hades was like, well, the only person I love is Persephone, or Core. I'm sorry, I'm going to keep messing that up. And Zeus was like, nobody else? And he was like, nobody else. So then Zeus was like, yeah, I totally planned this. I arranged this marriage. Everything, all the I's have been dotted, all the T's have been crossed. You're just free to take her whenever you're ready. So Hades takes her to the underworld, finds out that she doesn't know, but he's in this position where he's like, but you were promised to me, and we're husband and wife. I don't know what else to do except for be very hospitable and respectful of your boundaries. Which he does. He just doesn't release her. So, like, problematic, but not as problematic as every other man in this story has been. Except for maybe, like, Demeter's one-day lover. That's a weird situation to me, mostly because it was within the course of a few hours, they were lovers for life. And I can't relate. But gods are different, I guess. I don't know. So, while she's in the underworld, she starts to find out that not only is Hades not like the other guys, he might be, he's like a little bit coded like neurodivergent, and I can't figure out if that's the case or just, the characteristics of, because it's never really explained. He gets very nervous, he stutters, he has sort of a hard time getting his thoughts out, but it seems to be mostly a nervous habit as opposed to anything else. And this is where, like, I feel like the lack of characterization really suffers here, because I don't understand why he's like that. Especially when all the other gods, even Core and Demeter, have been shown to be very self-assured, very assertive. There's not anything that would, like, indicate that Hades would not also be the same way. But he's written as sort of a very, like, nervy, sort of meeker man who's, like, all about this woman that he's in love with, but is a little bit nervous to, like, express himself, isn't used to talking to people because he rules over the dead, and just has a trouble, like, communicating. And I wanted to know more, and I wanted to know, like, if it was just because he was the firstborn child of Kronos, so he spent the longest amount of time inside of Kronos' belly because he ate all of his children when they were born, or if it was just something to do with him being Lord of the Underworld, or something like that, but they don't really flesh that out, so you don't know why he's like that or where that behavior stems from. And like, I really feel like that could have been beneficial, especially because we get to a part in the story where Hades and, at this point, Persephone are spending regular afternoons together, talking to each other, getting to know each other, and when we get a little bit of their back and forth conversations, nothing about him, like, in this way pops up so that you learn anything about his character or anything like that. And so it makes it really hard for me to understand why this character acts this way, other than it just being an interesting bit of, like, quirky personality. And like, I don't know, I just, like, it makes it hard for me to believe that she ends up eventually falling in love with him, because we don't know anything about him as the readers beyond what we're being told. So, like, when Persephone does finally decide that she is in love with him, does not want to leave, it doesn't ring true, because, girl, you don't know anything about him, I don't know anything about him, and that's where I struggled with the characterization of the men in this book. Here in particular. Everything else I was like, okay, I can let that go. I'm not really that interested in Zeus or Poseidon as people. But I am interested in this one, especially when this character is supposed to be the main love interest for Persephone in the end. But Hades does treat her really well. He does offer her the food. Hecate makes a couple trips to the underworld to check in on her once they figure out, like, she is officially in the underworld. Hecate even warns her not to eat any of the food of the underworld, because if she does, she'll be bound to the land forever and not be able to leave. So Persephone at this point is sort of starving herself. Not that she needs to eat, she's a goddess, but she enjoys eating and does feel hunger. So she does starve herself, even though Hades keeps offering her very sumptuous meals at first. But then eventually Hades is like, oh, she's not comfortable eating, I'm not going to force her to be around all the food. So he starts eating separately so that he can go visit her full, so she doesn't feel tempted or, like, pressured into eating anything. So Hades isn't even trying to trap her there in the way that one might think he would, because he would be very motivated to do so. And he has these very respectful conversations with her, tells her, like, she's a goddess in her own right. She needs to reclaim her own power. She's queen of the underworld, so she has just as much authority as he does. And even though they sort of bump heads a little bit on how she expresses that authority, he does eventually relent and go, like, yeah, you're right. I did tell you that you were a goddess, but, you can't just do whatever you want. There are some rules down here, so we have to sort of set up some ground rules. And he's very rule-driven, which is also what made me go, is he a little bit neurodivergent? Because everything comes with, like, a price, and he's like, okay, well, if you're going to do this, then you also need to do this, and that's the only way this situation will work. And I was like, that's very interesting. I wish you would just explain it. But there's a point in the story where she had erased all of her memories of Ione via the muses, and when Orpheus comes to the underworld, him being a son of a muse ends up undoing the spell that made her forget Ione. So when she remembers Ione, she decides to go find her, and she finds her in the fields of Asphodel, which is where mortals go when they live unremarkable lives. And essentially it's like a purgatory. And she's so upset that Ione is here in the fields of Asphodel, because she's like the lover of a goddess, and anyone who has had a relationship with a god typically ends up in Elysium because they were loved by the gods. And she should also be there as well, but because this relationship was secret, nobody knew that, so she got shuffled off to the fields of Asphodel. So Persephone breaks one of the big rules of the underworld and moves Ione from the fields of Asphodel to Elysium, which is essentially paradise. And Ione ends up gaining her memory back of Persephone, and then they continue to engage in their relationship, but they know that Persephone will eventually go back, will eventually leave the underworld, and so they treat every day like it's their last together. And it gets to the point where, like, Hades knows, he finds out that, she's visiting her lover, that she has this lover. He offers for her lover to come live in the palace with them and be like, yeah, I'll respect whatever you're into. I respect you. But, like, you want to bring your lover here, you can do that. And this is the first point where, like, it strikes Persephone how much Hades, like, really respects her and views her as an equal and not just as a female object he desires, because he's willing to do this great thing, this great sacrifice that he clearly doesn't want to do, but he wants her to be happy and not miserable while she's there. So she ends up declining because she does not want Ione to come live in the palace. She doesn't think that's fair to her husband. She doesn't think it's fair to Ione. And she starts to, relent, and they start having these conversations because one of the conditions that Hades put upon her was that every hour she spends with Ione, she has to spend with him. So this is how they get to know each other, and they end up having these conversations back and forth where Hades is like, your mom did you a disservice by naming you Core, which means maiden. You need to reclaim your own name. So this is where Persephone ends up giving herself the name Persephone, and moves from being like innocent virginal maiden to adult woman goddess, queen of the underworld, Persephone, which was really powerful. The fact that she got to choose her own name, also very powerful. So I really enjoyed that. And he automatically takes up this name and is like, thank God, I'm so tired of calling you maiden, like this is the name you deserve. And he just continues to hype her up and build her up, and then eventually she ends up getting tricked by one of the daemons there, which is like the word that they use for spirits, like a household spirit or like a small spiritual entity. One of the demons there ends up telling Ione that if Persephone has some pomegranates, like some pomegranate seeds, she'll increase her power tenfold, and she'll be even more powerful of a goddess than before. So Ione really pressures Persephone into having some of these seeds, and then when it finally comes time for her to leave, it all comes out, and it's like a big haha got you moment, where this like shit ass servant, I hated this character, he was so nasty. Not like I hated him as he was a bad character, but like he was just a little like fucker that I wanted to see get his comeuppance, and he does. They turn him into a fucking owl for being a little rat fink, although they could have turned him into a rat, which would have been more satisfying. But also I like rats, so like a gross scraggly sewer rat maybe. It's not even the point. But eventually, like, Demeter, is murdering the mortals left and right because she's not getting her daughter back. Zeus is like, okay, I'm going to go down there. He sends Hermes first. Turns out she ate the seeds, so Hermes comes back. So Zeus is like, I'm going down there. Demeter's like, I'm going with you. So everybody is down there. Demeter, Hecate, Zeus, Hades, Persephone. They bring in Ione, and she admits that she gave Persephone the seeds. Persephone ate some of them. And so the solution that Zeus comes up with is the one that we're familiar with, where she spends as long as she can, which is 6 months, up in the mortal world, and then the other 6 months she spends in the underworld, because she did eat some of the seeds, and she needs to continue returning to the underworld to, like, re-up her power, because her powers are now tied with the underworld, so she can't exist away from the underworld for very long, otherwise she'll die. So she has to return to the underworld, but she still gets to spend time with her mom. But at this point, like, Demeter is like full in her rage goddess Billy badass stage. She's willing to tear down the entire underworld to bring her daughter back, but then Persephone kind of stops her from having this overwhelming temper tantrum by being like, hey, I actually do want to be here. I actually do have feelings for Hades, and I want to be here, but I also want to be with you. So like, this arrangement works really well for me and what I want. And Demeter, in like a pro move, because I was not anticipating this, I was still expecting her to go into like the irrational, overbearing mother territory, is like, okay, yes, fine, if this is what you want and you're happy, then I'm happy with this arrangement as well. And essentially, this is how we get the chthonic story of how the winter happens, the seasons of change and things like that, and it ends happily ever after. Persephone is happy with her husband Hades. They're actually kind of low-key in love, and Demeter is happy because she gets to spend time with her daughter 6 months out of the year, and she's also happy because she gets to embrace both dual like natures of her personality, because she's not just the giver of life, she can take it away and, cause winter. So she is like a goddess of earth and fertility, but also like the goddess of decay and like the withering of winter. And they both come into their own power by the end, and like girl boss their way off into the sunset, essentially. And it's a really good story. I really liked the reclaiming aspect of their powers. I liked more so that Persephone reclaimed her identity as separate from her mother, more than like the power aspect. I think that was just sort of like part and parcel for the whole deal. She was going to reclaim her personal power by reclaiming her identity, but I felt like her identity was more lost in the sauce, because she's always sort of depicted even through Demeter's eyes as like an extension of herself, as a part of her mother, as opposed to a separate individual. So when she does sort of take back her autonomy in that situation, it becomes a lot more profound and a lot more powerful than just sort of being like, I am a bad bitch, I have these bad bitch powers. Like, it's more that she got her identity and figured out who she was and who she wanted to be. And interestingly, and I said I was going to circle back to this, was that when everything is said and done, Iona's like, okay, well, now we can be together forever because you're here in the underworld, you're queen of the underworld, you're not leaving, so maybe I will move into the palace and we will be together. And then Persephone's like, actually, no. And I think it's because at this point she realizes that, like, this was her first love, and sort of she loved her so much because this was the first person to notice her as an individual, as a separate person away from her mother, and she doesn't need that anymore because she was able to reclaim her own identity and her own agency through this whole process, that she doesn't need to cling to this old love, this love that has died, and she can let it go. So she's finally ready to let it go, and so what she does is have Ione drink from the river Levy. That's so hard to say. So that she will forget everything and she can be reborn, and, you know, have another life in the mortal realm, while Persephone carries about her duties as queen of the underworld. And I think it's a really important thing that happened, that they weren't like, she can have her cake and eat it too, because it would have sort of lessened the impact of her finally being like, I kind of do want to be with Hades, if she was still holding on to this previous relationship. So I did really like that story. But like I said, I really found myself more drawn to Demeter's story. I found her story to be a lot more interesting, mostly because a lot of the rehash was in Persephone/Core's parts. A lot of the rehash was in that first section with Core, of going back over events that Demeter had already experienced to tell them from Core's perspective, or just her takeaway on certain things. And I feel like more so in the takeaway parts, less so than her perspective on like things, or things that happened differently from her point of view, but just in her takeaway on events, it was nice to know what she was thinking during this time, but I don't think it added anything substantial to that part of the story. So we were just sort of re-going over things we had just read a few chapters before. And then when they get to the underworld, there's a lot of that like repetition of, well, when I go back, you know, to Earth, when I go back to the mortal realm, when my mother comes to get me, I'm just waiting every day to return back up out of the underworld. Like, just a lot of that was over and over and over again, to the point where it's like, I know that you're waiting, you know that you're waiting, we all know that you're waiting. Say something different. And that's just like a personal pet peeve. I don't think it really took away from the story so much, but I was like, oh my gosh, if we keep saying it, I'm gonna go crazy. And so I feel like that probably weighed down that last half of the story, because there were other things happening in between all of this like repetition, but we had to keep repeating the things. So like it just sort of interrupted sort of how that back half went, when we could have just told a linear story and then maybe once or twice mentioned that she was going to eventually try to return back to the mortal realm, back to Earth. But otherwise, like I said, I really enjoyed this book. I found it to be very straightforward in the way that it told the story, which I kind of appreciated. I didn't have to like dig to find the meanings or the feminism or anything like that. It was right there for me to read. It was right there on page. There wasn't any sort of weird like nuances in character. Everything played out very well for me. And I found it to be enjoyable to read, even despite like the little flaws here and there. There were just things that I wish, like little tiny things I wish that would have made it better, especially the fleshing out of Hades' character, because he is eventually like the one true partner at the end of this this ride. I would have liked to know more about him, and we didn't learn that much, and so I didn't believe her. And I really wanted to believe her, but otherwise, an enjoyable story. I'm interested in reading more stuff from Hannah Lynn, definitely in the future, because I do think this was done very well. And yeah, that's going to be it. That's everything I have to say about Daughters of Olympus, you guys. Thank you for making it to the end of the video. I appreciate your faces. Don't forget, if you would like to join in the book club, or just if you're reading along for fun, the next book we are reading is The Heir of Venus by Laura Shepperson. And I will catch you guys all next month when I recap this one. Also, I'm going to do more videos, so there's stuff in between. But until then, you guys, happy crafting. I appreciate your faces. Bye.